Hello, this Science and Sport video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, and we're looking at Learning Aim C, all about the respiratory system. So this is for C2 functions of the respiratory system, and there are actually going to be 3 separate videos linked to C2. This is part 1 and looks at the breathing mechanisms. So your specification for C2, as I said, has 3 separate subtopics. Mechanisms of breathing, basically how we inspire and expire air. Gases exchange, how we move gases from our lungs to our blood, and our blood to our muscles. And lung volumes. When we're at rest, we breathe a certain amount and move a certain amount of air in and out of our body. When we exercise, that amount changes, and you have to particularly know these 3 lung volumes. We already hopefully know the anatomy of the respiratory system, so we know we've got a nasal and mouth cavity, our pharynx, our larynx, we've got our epiglottis that protects us from choking and having food go down our air tube. We've got our trachea, the main air tube that divides into a left and a right bronchus. We've got 2 lobes on this side, 3 on the right side. We've got smaller bronchioles that transport the air, eventually getting to the alveolar ducts, these bunch of grapes, basically, on the ends of the bronchioles. That is where diffusion happens, gaseous exchange happens. So we're going to be talking about how do we get air in and out of our lungs from our external environment into our actual lung and alveoli. How do we get the oxygen into our blood and the CO2 from our blood into our alveoli? And how much air do we move? And do we expel all our air? And those kinds of volumes related to our lung capacities, or lung volumes. Simplest overview of the 3 main functions of the respiratory system. These are the jobs that this system does for us. Firstly, the mechanisms of breathing. This is how we physically get air from our atmosphere, the external environment, inside our body into our internal environment. So we physically have mechanisms, movements, that suck air into our lungs and move air out of our lungs. And that description, that function of this system is the mechanisms of breathing. And that's to do with this chest cavity and our respiratory muscles. That's topic number 1. Then we have to look at gaseous exchange. So we've got air with oxygen in it into our lungs, into our alveoli. How do we get it from our alveoli into our blood to be able to be taken to the muscles? Gas exchange. So we diffuse oxygen and it gets to the muscles. That's called external respiration, the diffusion that happens at our lungs. Oxygen in, CO2 out. The blood is carrying our oxygen to our muscles. When it gets here, it's got to get from our blood into our muscle cells, our skeletal type 1 muscle cells, or type 2A. So it diffuses again, and this is called internal respiration, where oxygen diffuses from blood to muscles and CO2 diffuses from muscles to blood. So we've got gaseous exchange happening at the lungs, external respiration, and at the muscles, internal respiration. That's topic 2. Topic 3 is lung volumes. When we breathe when we breathe gently or quiet breathing, which is at rest, we don't move a great volume of air in and out of our lungs each time. If we start to exercise a bit, we breathe slightly more deeper or possibly faster. And when we're working hard, we breathe much deeper and we move a greater volume of air, and we look at some of those volumes. That's topic 3. Now, you could get a question as nice and kind and simple as state 2 functions of the respiratory system. And to get your 2 marks, you'd have to state, because it just wants the name of 2 of those 3 functions. Doesn't ask for any description or explanation, it just wants those 3. So that's easy knowledge. So this video is focused on the function number 1, mechanisms of breathing. This is the physicality of being able to move air into the body and out of the body. And obviously the air coming in is rich with oxygen that we want to get to our muscles, and the air being moved out or breathed out is full of CO2 that we need to get rid of. A term I mentioned in the previous video was pulmonary ventilation. So anything pulmonary is to do with the lungs. And pulmonary ventilation is the process of air being transported between the atmosphere, the external environment, the air outside of our body, and into the lungs, or the body's internal environment. So pulmonary ventilation is that movement in and that movement out of air. So it's a term you need to understand. The rate at which this happens depends on what we're doing. So we move more air in and out if we're exercising. We move less air in and out if we're at rest. You obviously need to appreciate the two directions that air is moved. So inspiration refers to the breathing in of air into the lungs. Expiration is the movement of air out of the lungs. So some simple terms, pulmonary ventilation includes inspiration and expiration, moving air in both directions. Now, the way I try to convey this is through MVPA as a little acronym, or actually it probably should be MVPA. The M stands for muscles and movement, the respiratory muscles that work to create a certain movement, the volume change that happens as a result of that muscular movement, the pressure change that results from that volume change, and the effect that this has on airflow. So ultimately I'm going to teach you MVPA for breathing in and breathing out. But before we get into that, I need you to understand the relationship between volume and pressure. You can remember Boyle's law. It's a bit more biological, that you're certainly not on your specification, but at worst, understand the principle of what Boyle's law is about. Boyle's law basically says volume and pressure are inversely related. And what inversely related means, when one goes up, the other goes down. And that's the rule you've got to remember. So if we change the volume, we change the pressure. If the volume goes up, the pressure goes down. Okay? If the volume goes down, the pressure goes up. That's it. Okay? So Boyle's law refers to this inverse relationship between volume and pressure. Now, when we're breathing, we change the volume of our chest cavity, our thorax. When we change that volume, we might make it bigger. We increase the volume. What happens as a result of that is the pressure inside the cavity goes down, and vice versa. So that's the principle you've got to understand. The next principle is, how do we change volumes? Well, we've got this rib cage, and we know it's already got cartilaginous joints between the ribs and the sternum, and when we breathe in, our muscles, our respiratory muscles, pull that rib cage up and out, making it bigger, making our thorax bigger. And we also hopefully know that when the diaphragm contracts, it goes from its relaxed dome-shaped position to its flattened, contracted position. Again, both of those together mean that the space inside the chest, inside the thorax, is bigger. The volume is higher. The volume increases. Now, we know from Boyle's law, if the volume inside the chest cavity is being increased, then the pressure will go down. Vice versa. If the if the ribs were to go in and go down, and the diaphragm went back to its relaxed state, the space, the volume inside the thoracic cavity decreases, and we know if the volume decreases that the pressure goes up. That's kind of the basic principle of breathing in and out. Volume affecting pressure, which ultimately will affect where the air goes. This little graph here just shows where there's a high volume, there's a low pressure. Where there's a low volume, there's a relatively high pressure. So it's inversely proportional. Okay. The other principle is that, and this applies to not just this topic, but the gas exchange topic, is that when it comes to pressures, we're talking about higher or lower pressures of air. So gases move, or air moves, down gradients, down pressure gradients. So if we've got one place which is a high pressure, and we've got another place which is a low pressure, air will move from the high to the low place. The same applies to gases when we talk about gas exchange. If we've got where there's high amount of one gas and another place where there's a low concentration or amount of another gas, the high moves to the low. So it's all about high to low, high to low, high to low. Just added here, down pressure gradients means air moving from high to low pressure. That's the other sort of rule to remember with this topic that will link to other topics as well. So when we breathe in, our atmospheric pressure, the pressure outside us in our external environment, is relatively higher than the pressure inside our lungs. We've breathed in, we've got a big space in our chest cavity, our ribs are pulled up and out. There's a big volume and a relatively lower pressure. So air gets sucked in because it goes from high to low. When we breathe out, our chest cavity gets smaller, our diaphragm goes back to being dome-shaped, our ribs come in, which reduces the volume inside, which increases the pressure inside. So the pressure in our lungs then is relatively high compared to the outside external pressure, which is relatively low. So air gets pushed out high to low. It's all about high to low, down a pressure gradient, down a pressure gradient. Even though it looks like it's going upwards, it's down from a high to a low pressure gradient. Okay, so there's the principle. Air moves from high to low, from high to low. And it's the volume that affects the pressure relatively. Complicated, possibly. Slightly more advanced, but I want to include some numbers. So pressure, atmospheric pressure, air pressure, is measured in millimeters of mercury, capital Hg, millimeters of mercury. Now, atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury, and it doesn't tend to change. That's a constant. Test our lungs, or if we're not, if you froze a moment, not breathing in, not breathing out, this is our lung shape. We've got our relaxed dome-shaped diaphragm. We've got ribs low and in, and a relatively small volume inside our lungs. So the pressure outside is 760. The pressure inside our alveoli, inside our lungs, is 762. That's when it's balanced. Nothing is going on. When we breathe in, we change our chest cavity space. So when we breathe in, our ribs go up and out, and our diaphragm flattens, and this sort of paler line here is showing the change in space of our lungs. The volume inside our chest cavity gets larger because our ribs have pulled up and out and our diaphragm flattens. So the chest cavity volume is now bigger. Now with Boyle's law, we know that if the volume increases, the relative pressure inside decreases because it's inversely related. And you can see on this diagram that when we're breathing in, our alveolar pressure drops from 760 to 758, so it's a bit lower. It's lower than the 760 outside. So from our other sort of rule, which is things move from high to low, it makes sense, therefore, that air from the atmosphere, where it's relatively higher, is sucked into our lungs, where it's relatively lower. Hence, we breathe in air. When we breathe out, basically, our respiratory muscles relax, so the chest cavity goes back to being its smaller shape, the ribs go down and in, the diaphragm moves back to being dome-shaped again, the volume inside our chest cavity is relatively small, and it reduces, and if the volume drops or decreases, we know that Boyle's law says volume decreases, pressure increases relatively. So the volume inside our breathing out chest cavity and the pressure inside our breathing out chest cavity is now 762, which is relatively higher than our 760 in the outside. So it's high inside and low inside. And we know from our high to low rule that air will be pushed out as things go from high to low. So the consequences of our respiratory muscles moving our chest cavity, changing the volume, is that the pressure inside changes relative to the constant external environment atmospheric pressure. That's the fundamental principle of the mechanics of breathing. But I'm going to break it down to the MVPA process that I talked to you about. First of all, then, we're going to look at the mechanics of breathing or mechanisms of breathing at rest only, not talking about exercise at all. And this is sometimes called quiet breathing. So, MVPA. We're looking, first of all, at how we breathe in, how we move air from our external environment, from the atmosphere, into our internal environment, into our lungs. So we're looking at airflow in. This is the acronym, muscles and movement in that order, volume change, pressure change, and therefore airflow. So what happens? First of all, our respiratory muscles contract. So our diaphragm is a respiratory muscle. When it's at rest, it's dome-shaped. When it contracts, it flattens. So this green diaphragm here is contracted. We've got external. So these are the two layers of intercostal muscles. We've got external ones on the outside and internal ones on the inside. And it's specifically the external intercostal muscles that contract to pull our ribs up and out. So notably, the respiratory muscles contract to make the movement happen. The external intercostals pull, move our ribcage up and out. Our diaphragm contracts to flatten, both of which change the shape or the volume of the thorax, this chest cavity, making it larger. So this muscle and movement occurs to create a volume change. Now, because it's made a bigger space, the volume inside is bigger. It increases the volume inside the thoracic cavity. Boyle's law says if the volume goes up, pressure will do the opposite. So pressure inside the lungs relatively is small. So pressure inside is relatively small compared to the atmospheric pressure. So we've got a higher atmospheric pressure outside and a smaller or a lower atmospheric alveolar pressure inside. The rule is things move from high to low and air will flow into our lungs. We breathe in. Now, we don't breathe a massive amount of air in at rest. We breathe in about half a litre. And the amount of air that we breathe in and out is called tidal volume. Something else we need to recognise is because breathing in requires muscles to make this movement happen, muscular action, muscular contraction. And we call this an active process. We actively make our muscles contract to move the ribcage up and out, and our diaphragm actively flattens. So it's an active process. And that will make sense when we talk later about expiration. So expiration at rest. Again, we can use the MVPA process to explain how we move air from inside our lungs and expel it out through our respiratory system into the external environment, into the atmosphere. So in order to breathe in, we had this muscular contraction, we moved our ribcage up and out, we contracted our diaphragm and flattened it, which changed the volume, which changed the pressure, and air flowed in. All that really happens in order to move air out is those respiratory muscles relax. Because logically speaking, if our external intercostal muscles stop contracting, stop pulling our ribcage up and out, then the ribcage will go back down and in. If our diaphragm stops contracting and flattening, then it will return to its relaxed, dome-shaped position. And both of those actions will change the volume of the thoracic cavity. So the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles both just relax. They stop being told to contract. The brain stops telling them to contract. And when they stop contracting, ribs go down and in, diaphragm flattens. The consequence of that is that the thoracic volume is then decreased, the space inside is smaller, and we know Boyle's law says if the volume decreases, pressure does the opposite. So the pressure inside the thoracic cavity and inside the lungs is relatively high compared to the atmospheric pressure. And we know also that things move from high to low. So the relatively high pressure of air inside will then be pushed out to the relatively lower pressure, atmospheric pressure. Remember, atmospheric pressure at 760 millimeters of mercury doesn't change. So airflow is outwards. So that's it. Breathing in is active. Breathing out at rest is passive. And it's passive because it doesn't happen because of muscular contraction. All the muscles do is they relax, and that's a passive process. So it's only labelled as being active when muscles contract to make it happen. So breathing in or inspiration at rest is an active process. Expiration at rest, breathing out, is a passive process. So there's a few diagrams here that just show breathing in, breathing out, and the diagrammatic changes. By all means, pause, have a look at them. There's another one here that's breathing in with a bit of text to go through it. That's breathing out at rest. What I've talked through, but you might take something from those diagrams. By all means, have a look. Here's a summary of the stages of inspiration, expiration. Exam questions might just ask you about inspiration at rest. It might just ask you about expiration at rest. And you need to know these bits of information separately. You need to translate the question or interpret the question to make sure you answer what it's asking you about. Don't just write about everything because you might know it. So this is mechanisms of breathing at rest, in and out. Logically then we've got to go through exercise and what happens in exercise, what's different about breathing and moving air in and out of our body in exercise, which is typically a bit more frantic and typically a bit more involved. We call it forced breathing. Now, I mentioned in the C1 Anatomy of the Respiratory System video that we have some what we call accessory muscles that we use only during exercise to exaggerate our rib cage, our thoracic cavity changes. We don't just sort of gently breathe in and passively breathe out. We frantically breathe in deeper and we breathe out faster and more powerfully. So we have extra muscles to help us. These are called accessory muscles. Notice that the same muscles help you breathe in as well as the accessory muscles. You should know sternocleidomastoid up here and pec minor, one of your chest muscles. They help you breathe in more frantically. There's another muscle up here called scalenes. That's another accessory muscle. Breathing out in exercise is an active process. We do it forcefully, we do it intentionally, we do it because of muscular contraction. So we have our internal intercostal muscles helping us. They're the main breathing out muscle, which are assisted by our rectus abdominis, QL, so quadratus lumborum, also latissimus dorsi, help us as well. So I'll talk about that later. So, breathing in during exercise, MVPA. Obviously, when we breathe in, when we're exercising, we need to move bigger volumes of air. And the way we do that is by exaggerating the volume change, making our thoracic cavity, when you breathe shallowly at rest, you don't move your ribcage much. When you breathe more deeply and frantically in exercise, your chest cavity comes up and out even more. And that's basically what happens. So, when we breathe in, our diaphragm flattens as normal. Our external intercostal muscles contract as normal, pulling our ribcage up and out. But also, we have these accessory extra muscles to assist us and increase the sort of size of that movement. So we've got sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, and pectoralis minor. Now, they help increase the volume of this chest cavity even more. And you need something that denotes it being even more than at rest. So the volume of the thoracic cavity and therefore the lung volume is increased more. Now Boyle's law says these two are inversely proportional. So if volume goes up even more, the pressure will go down and decrease even more. So the pressure in here is less, even more, or even, I should say, even less than the external atmospheric pressure. So if there's a bigger gradient, a high to a really low, more air will flow in, more air will be sucked in. So this process is an active process. We've got this muscular action, this exaggerated muscular action that exaggerates the thoracic volume change and the pressure drop inside, exaggerating and increasing the gradient, the high to a really low pressure, and therefore more air moves. This is an active process based on this being now a muscular action. Breathing in at rest is active. Breathing in exercise is also active. So let's look at breathing out during exercise. So there's a change. Breathing out at rest was passive, if you remember. All that happened is those external intercostals and that diaphragm relaxed and went back down and in and went back to its dome-shaped relaxed position. Changed the volume and air was pushed out. Passive process. No muscular contraction made it happen. This is different. Breathing out in exercise is forced breathing out. We need to forcibly push the air out. We need to change that volume actively. We have muscles that contract to make that happen faster and more dramatically. Okay, so let's look at what happens. First of all, the diaphragm relaxes. So it was contracted to breathe in. It goes back to its dome-shaped position because it has to relax. That's the same as in rest, at rest. The external intercostals also do the same. They have to relax. You know, they don't want to be pulling out anymore. They just relax. That's the same. But in exercise, to force air out, we have our internal intercostal muscles. So this inside layer of intercostal muscles between our ribs, they contract and pull the ribs down and in. They actively pull them down and in. Also, we've got accessory muscles that assist this process. We've got latissimus dorsi, we've got rectus abdominis, we've sometimes got obliques perhaps, and they help pull this chest cavity down and in. So because of this now active muscular contraction, both the internal intercostals and the accessory muscles, we've got a dramatic change or decrease in volume of this chest cavity. So you need to exaggerate the fact that it's not just a little decrease like the passive rest action. It's an active decrease in volume. It's a bigger decrease in volume. So the volume decreases more. Because of Boyle's law, we know that if the volume decreases, pressure will do the opposite. Pressure will dramatically increase relatively inside the chest cavity, inside the lungs, compared to the atmospheric pressure outside. So we've got a high to a lower in that direction. And because there's this now more dramatic pressure gradient, a steeper gradient from the high to the lower outside, more air will flow. So all the way through this process, you've got to explain how this volume decreases more, the pressure decreases more, the airflow out is more, because we're forcing air out more dramatically. Tidal volume then, in exercise, we know we breathe a greater tidal volume in, we also move more air out. So tidal volume, again, it demonstrates how tidal volume has increased. So there are some diagrams here for you to have a look at the respiratory mechanisms at rest, breathing in, breathing out with these accessory muscles labelled here. Pause the video, have a look. It shows you the volume and pressure changes here. Again, it's what I've talked through, but do have a little look at those diagrams. So to summarise, we've got modes of breathing. We've got quiet breathing at rest, where breathing in is active, but breathing out is passive, just involves relaxation of those respiratory muscles. In forced breathing during exercise, breathing in is active, we've got our normal breathing muscles plus accessory muscles, and actually breathing out is active. We've got our internal intercostal muscles now, and then additional accessory muscles helping force air out. So that kind of summarizes the modes of breathing. You might get questions like this. So you might get questions saying, describe the mechanism of expiration during exercise. So not only does it specify it just wants the process of expiration, it's telling you it just wants you to talk about exercise. Don't mention rest, don't mention inspiration, irrelevant for this particular question. And there's the mark scheme for the question, so it just requires you to talk about the exercise element during exercise. Another question might be, describe the mechanism of breathing during inspiration. So again, it tells you it just wants inspiration. By that, I would assume it means at rest. It hasn't specified that, but I would always assume it meant at rest. And again, it basically, you go through MVPA, and it gives you, 4 marks, nice and easy. Describe the function of the external intercostal muscles during inspiration. So it just wants you to talk about breathing in, and just wants you to talk about the external intercostal muscles. So talking about diaphragm is not relevant to this particular answer. So just talk about the role that it has in initiating the pressure changes and the volume changes, the pressure changes, and the ultimate movement. Interesting, it just picks on the external intercostal muscles and you ignore the diaphragm, but there you go. There's no particular marks awarded for talking about the diagram, it's just that role.